The mansion belonged to Alessandro Moretti, a place where silence itself felt controlled. Every corridor was monitored, every movement calculated, and every person inside understood that nothing in this estate happened without his awareness. Claire Bennett entered that world only as a worker, not as someone who belonged there. She had no power, no influence, and no safety beyond her ability to remain unnoticed. Her life in Boston was already built on struggle, medical bills, unstable jobs, and the responsibility of raising her son alone. Her child, Noah Bennett, was 5 years old. She had spent years hiding him from anyone connected to her past, believing invisibility was the only way to keep him safe. That night, she was assigned to assist a private elite gathering inside the Moretti mansion. Politicians, businessmen, and influential figures filled the estate, all connected through quiet networks of corruption and power. A last-minute childcare issue forced Claire into a decision she never should have made. She brought Noah with her, hiding him in a restricted staff corridor, hoping he would remain unseen. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere already felt unusual. Guests spoke softly, movements were controlled, and security presence was heavier than normal. That was when Alessandro Moretti arrived. His presence was not announced. The entire room reacted instantly. Conversation stopped, staff froze, and even powerful guests adjusted their behavior without instruction. Claire immediately lowered her gaze. Noah shifted slightly behind her. Alessandro's attention locked onto the child. He stopped walking. The silence deepened. His expression did not show anger or curiosity. It showed recognition. As if something buried deep in the past had surfaced in front of him again, Claire felt her body tense. Something about the way he looked at the child was not normal. It was not random observation. It was focused, personal, and emotionally disturbed. Alessandro began walking toward them, slow, controlled, certain. Each step reduced the distance between them, while the rest of the mansion remained frozen. He stopped directly in front of Claire and Noah. No one spoke. Security did not move. Guests did not breathe normally. His gaze remained fixed on Noah, not threatening, not curious, but heavy with recognition and memory. Claire could not move. The exits no longer felt accessible. Security patterns had shifted without explanation. Alessandro gave a quiet instruction. The mansion responded instantly. Movement was restricted. Exits were secured. The environment shifted into controlled containment. Claire realized she was no longer inside a normal event. She was inside a system that had just changed around her. Noah held her hand tightly. Alessandro remained focused on the child, while something in his control felt slightly unstable beneath the surface. Staff reacted with visible fear. Vanessa DeMarco watched from a distance, studying the situation carefully. Hours later, Claire was escorted into a restricted office. A sealed folder was placed on the desk. Inside were financial records and archived documents tied to Moretti operations. A photograph sat on top. Her late sister stood beside Alessandro Moretti. In her arms was a newborn child. Noah. Claire stared at the image, unable to process the connection between people she believed were unrelated. The door opened behind her. Alessandro entered the room. He looked at the photograph, then at Claire, and remained silent. Claire Bennett had never believed in safety. Not the kind wealthy men promise with polished smiles and locked gates. For her, safety had always been temporary, something borrowed from luck and taken back without warning. But when she was escorted through the iron gates of the Moretti estate with her child held tightly in her arms, she understood that this place was not designed to protect anyone. It was designed to contain them. The mansion rose beyond the trees, like a silent empire carved from stone and glass. Every window reflected control. Every corridor whispered ownership. Claire could feel at the moment she stepped inside that she was no longer a guest. She was part of something she could not yet name. Alessandro Moretti did not greet her immediately. His presence was felt long before it was seen. The staff moved differently here, careful, rehearsed, as if even breathing too loudly might trigger punishment. Claire noticed how no one made eye contact for longer than a second. It was not respect. It was fear trained into obedience. She was placed in a private wing under the label of protective custody, though nothing about it felt protective. The doors locked automatically behind her. The windows were reinforced, but beautifully disguised. Even the air felt controlled, filtered through systems she could not see but constantly sensed. Her son stayed close to her side, unusually quiet for a child his age. Something about the house seemed to lower voices, to press down energy. Claire tried to comfort him, but even her own voice felt smaller here. Vanessa DeMarco appeared on the second day. She did not knock. She entered like someone who had always belonged there. Her presence carried elegance sharpened by subtle hostility. She studied Claire with a calm that disguised calculation. Every word she spoke was layered, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. She did not need to threaten Claire directly. The mansion itself did that job for her. Rumors spread without being spoken aloud. Servants exchanged looks when Claire passed. Some avoided her completely. Others watched too long. It became clear quickly that Alessandro Moretti's household did not function like a normal estate. It functioned like a system built around one man's silence. Claire began noticing patterns. Security rotations that changed depending on Alessandro's presence. Rooms that were cleaned but never used. Entire corridors that remained locked despite appearing fully maintained. And most unsettling of all, certain doors that reacted only to specific staff members, as if the mansion itself recognized hierarchy. She learned fragments of Alessandro's past without anyone telling her directly. A dead wife whose name was never spoken after sunset. A missing child whose absence had reshaped the household into something colder than grief. These were not stories shared openly. They were warnings disguised as silence. What unsettled Claire most was not what people said, but what they refused to say when Alessandro's name was mentioned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Expressions tightened. Even Vanessa, who seemed unshakable, changed her tone slightly whenever his presence was near. Alessandro finally appeared in person on the third night. He did not speak much. He did not need to. His silence filled the room in a way that felt heavier than words. When he looked at Claire's child, the entire atmosphere changed. It was not curiosity. It was recognition without confirmation. The staff noticed it immediately. Fear spread in small, invisible waves. No one reacted openly, but everyone understood something had shifted. Claire felt it too. Alessandro was not looking at the child the way strangers look at strangers. It was deeper, more fractured, as if something buried in his past had been disturbed. After that night, new rules were quietly enforced. No one was allowed to leave the estate without approval. Certain sections of the mansion were restricted without explanation. Even communication outside the property became monitored under the guise of security. Claire tried to maintain normalcy for her son, but normal no longer existed here. The child began noticing things too. The way adults lowered their voices near certain doors. The way guards stopped moving when Alessandro passed. The way Vanessa's smile never reached her eyes. One afternoon, while wandering a permitted corridor, Claire discovered a maintenance door slightly ajar. Inside, she found a storage room filled with outdated but carefully preserved items. Children's toys, clothing that looked untouched by time, and medical equipment arranged with precision rather than chaos. It did not feel abandoned. It felt preserved. That discovery stayed in her mind longer than she expected, especially when she noticed Alessandro, sometimes standing near that same wing late at night, alone, without guards. He never entered. He simply stood there, as if proximity was enough to keep something from disappearing completely. Staff whispered that he only slept properly when he was near the rooms no one else was allowed to enter. They did not call it grief. They called it consequence. Claire's situation grew more complicated when she began reviewing documents accidentally left in her assigned study space. Financial records, private transfers, coded references to institutions she did not recognize. But names repeated enough times to form a pattern. Politicians, hospitals, private security firms, all connected in ways that suggested something far larger than business. Racism and class hierarchy inside the mansion were subtle but constant. Wealthy visitors who arrived for late-night meetings treated staff like invisible furniture. Even Claire, despite her temporary status, was reminded through tone and gesture that she did not belong to their world. Yet Alessandro treated her differently in ways no one could explain. Not kindness, not cruelty, something more controlled. As if her presence had become an equation he was still trying to solve. His attention toward the child increased over time. Not openly, not violently, but consistently. Security reports changed subtly. More guards assigned nearby. More surveillance added without announcement. Claire began to understand something frightening. She was not being protected because she was valuable. She was being kept because she was connected to something unresolved. One evening, while the mansion was unusually quiet, Claire discovered a hidden medical file tucked between archived documents in a restricted office. The file referenced birth records that did not align with official history. Names were altered, dates adjusted, entire identities reshaped on paper. And then she saw it. A file linked to Alessandro Moretti's missing infant years ago. Her hands went cold before she fully understood what she was reading. The document suggested not only that the child had not simply disappeared, but that records had been deliberately rewritten by someone with access to both medical and financial authority. Claire stepped back slowly, her mind connecting fragments she did not want to connect. Her child, the mansion, Alessandro's reaction, the silence that followed recognition. For the first time since entering the estate, she understood that she was not here by accident. That night, she could not sleep. The mansion felt different again, not more dangerous, but more aware, as if it knew she had seen something she was never meant to find. And in the early hours before dawn, she found something else waiting for her. A photograph slipped beneath her door. It showed Alessandro standing beside a woman Claire recognized immediately, her sister. And in the center of the image, a newborn child held in the same hospital room where official records claimed nothing had ever gone wrong. Claire stood frozen as realization settled in slowly, painfully. Nothing in this mansion had ever been random, and somewhere deep within its locked wings, someone had been waiting for her to discover exactly this. The mansion no longer felt like a home or a prison. It had become something far more dangerous in Claire Bennett's understanding, an archive of crimes that had never been erased, only hidden behind luxury and silence. Every corridor she walked now felt heavier, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of years of buried decisions made by people who believed power meant erasing consequences. Claire remained inside Alessandro Moretti's estate under what the staff called protective custody. No one explained what she was being protected from, but the increased presence of armed guards and silent watchers made it clear she was no longer free to leave. Her son stayed under constant watch, not with open hostility, but with a disturbing level of attention that suggested he was no longer just a child in the mansion. He was an asset or a risk, depending on who was observing. Alessandro Moretti remained distant, yet his presence shaped every corner of the estate. He did not move like a man surrounded by danger, but like a man who had already survived it too many times to fear it anymore. His control over the staff was absolute without requiring visible force. A single glance from him could shift the entire emotional temperature of a room, and Claire noticed how even the most powerful men who visited the estate lowered their voices in his presence. Damian Cross entered this world through official channels that felt anything but official. A federal investigator on paper, he operated in a space where law enforcement blurred into negotiation with criminal power structures. His arrival inside the Moretti estate was quiet, but it shifted the balance of tension immediately. He observed more than he spoke, noting patterns in security rotations, financial records, and emotional reactions rather than relying on direct questioning. Claire found herself drawn into fragmented discoveries rather than clear explanations. Financial documents hidden within restricted offices revealed patterns that extended far beyond the Moretti organization. Payments flowed through political figures, corporate foundations, and legal institutions that were supposed to regulate them. Senators, judges, and private contractors were all indirectly connected through layers of financial masking that made direct accountability nearly impossible. The most disturbing detail was not the corruption itself, but the consistency of its structure. It was not chaotic crime. It was organized silence. Every exposed name seemed to protect 3 more hidden ones. Every missing file pointed toward systems designed to erase evidence before it could become truth. As Claire continued investigating with hesitant caution, she began noticing references to Alessandro's past that were never spoken aloud. His dead wife was described in fragments by staff who quickly changed the subject whenever her name surfaced. His missing child was treated as a wound the mansion refused to acknowledge directly, yet everything about the estate seemed built around the absence of that child. The nursery wing remained sealed, but Claire discovered subtle signs that it had not been abandoned in neglect. It had been preserved. Toys remained carefully arranged, furniture covered but not discarded, as if time itself had been frozen in expectation of return. That realization unsettled her more than any visible threat inside the mansion. Alessandro's emotional trauma became clearer through absence rather than confession. He rarely stayed in rooms associated with family life, yet staff reported that he sometimes stood outside the locked nursery doors for long periods without speaking. His silence during those moments was not emptiness, it was restraint. Something within him remained unresolved, and the mansion seemed to orbit around that unresolved grief. Rival Mafia families began shifting their attention toward Claire in ways that felt increasingly dangerous. Her presence inside the Moretti estate was no longer seen as coincidence or temporary arrangement. It was being interpreted as leverage. Some saw her as a weakness in Alessandro's control. Others began to suspect she held unknowable importance within his private decisions. Vanessa DeMarco amplified this uncertainty with precision. Her influence spread through elite social circles connected to the mansion's visitors. She never directly attacked Claire with force or confrontation. Instead, she shaped perception, suggesting instability, hidden motives, and dangerous proximity to Alessandro's private affairs. Her manipulation worked because it never required proof, only repetition. Inside the mansion, surveillance was no longer subtle. Cameras were embedded into architectural details, so seamlessly they appeared decorative. Yet Claire began noticing patterns in their movement. They were not simply recording. They were tracking behavior. Certain rooms triggered increased monitoring. Certain conversations caused security shifts. And her son's presence seemed to activate more focused observation than any political visitor ever received. Fear within the staff deepened as Claire moved closer to restricted areas. Even those who served the Moretti family for years avoided direct acknowledgement of Alessandro's emotional state. They obeyed him without hesitation, but their obedience carried anxiety, as if one wrong action could collapse something far larger than their individual roles. Claire's emotional state fractured between survival instinct and growing curiosity. She was afraid of Alessandro, yet increasingly aware that fear alone did not explain everything she was witnessing. There were patterns of protection hidden within control and restraint hidden within power. When her son was observed by Alessandro from a distance, it was not with hostility, but with a focused stillness that suggested recognition rather than suspicion. Hidden financial records she uncovered deepened the moral complexity of her situation. Trafficking networks linked through political funding channels suggested victims far beyond anything she had initially imagined. The system was not limited to one empire. It was interconnected across multiple power structures that reinforced each other's secrecy. Claire's emotional paranoia intensified as she realized her own history might not be separate from this world. Her late sister's name appeared indirectly in old reports connected to investigative efforts that had been quietly erased. The implication was subtle but devastating. Someone close to Claire had once tried to expose parts of the system and had not survived the attempt. Despite the danger, emotional trust between Claire and Alessandro began forming in fragmented ways. It was not built through comfort, but through shared recognition of loss. Alessandro never explained his actions, but certain decisions, silent protection of her son, removal of specific threats, controlled intervention during internal disputes, suggested protective intent that contradicted his reputation entirely. The emotional atmosphere of the mansion shifted further as internal betrayal began surfacing. Individuals once considered loyal were quietly removed from positions of influence. Their disappearances were not public, but their absence was noticeable enough to create tension among remaining staff. The message was clear. Disloyalty was not debated. It was eliminated. Claire's understanding of the mansion evolved from confusion into reluctant awareness. This was not simply a residence of power. It was a containment structure for secrets that could destabilize entire governments if exposed. And within that structure, she and her son were no longer outsiders. They were now part of the system's most fragile equilibrium. The emotional/interesting hook revealed itself in fragments rather than revelation. Claire began to understand that Alessandro did not simply guard the mansion because of enemies outside. He guarded it because of what had already been done inside it. Decisions that could not be undone, only contained through control, silence, and sacrifice. The recording she eventually discovered changed everything she thought she understood. It was hidden within a secure archive accessible only through layered authentication systems embedded in Alessandro's private network. The file contained partial audio and fragmented documentation, enough to confirm a truth that had been carefully buried. The recording proved that someone inside Alessandro's empire had authorized the kidnapping of his child years earlier. The voice was not unfamiliar. It belonged to someone still present within the structure of power surrounding the estate. The implication was not only betrayal, it was continuity. The threat had never left. Claire stood frozen as the realization settled into her understanding. The danger was not a past event being uncovered. It was an ongoing system still operating in the present. As security systems inside the mansion shifted unexpectedly, locking certain corridors and activating emergency protocols, Claire realized something had changed. The discovery had not remained hidden. It had been detected. And somewhere inside the estate, someone now knew exactly what she had just uncovered. Word count, 1,600 words. Claire's life inside Alessandro Moretti's world changed. A moment's silence inside the mansion stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like surveillance. Every hallway, every staircase, every corner of the estate carried a pressure that made even breathing feel like permission rather than freedom. What had once appeared as protection slowly revealed itself as containment. And in that containment, Claire and the child became something the entire criminal structure of the East Coast could no longer ignore. Within days of their presence becoming known beyond the mansion walls, whispers spread through New York, Boston, and Chicago. Powerful families who once treated Alessandro Moretti with cautious respect now spoke his name with something closer to fear. Because protecting a woman was one thing. Protecting a child tied to unknown bloodlines was something else entirely. It meant weakness. It meant exposure. And in their world, exposure was a death sentence waiting to happen. The first threats did not arrive as violence. They arrived as messages. Subtle warnings delivered through corrupted officials, silent financial withdrawals, and erased identities of anyone who had once been connected to Claire's past. Entire records were scrubbed from hospitals, schools, and government databases. It was not random. It was coordinated. Someone wanted Claire isolated from her history before eliminating her future. Inside Alessandro's empire, the shift was immediate. Security protocols increased without announcement. Mansion exits were monitored in silence. Staff members who once moved freely now walked as if every step might be reviewed later. The child, too young to understand the weight of the situation, became the center of invisible attention. Guards repositioned themselves instinctively whenever he entered a room, not out of affection but calculation. Vanessa DeMarco saw opportunity in that tension. Among the elite circles surrounding Moretti operations, she began spreading narratives carefully designed to fracture trust. She did not accuse directly. Instead, she planted ideas. That Claire was not what she claimed. That the child's presence was not accidental. That Alessandro's attention had been compromised by emotional instability. In their world, suggestion was more dangerous than truth. Public spaces became battlegrounds perception. At elite gatherings, Claire was met with cold glances and deliberate exclusion. Conversations stopped when she entered. Glasses tilted in judgment rather than invitation. The unspoken message was clear. She did not belong. Not in their social structure, not in their economic class, and certainly not in Alessandro Moretti's orbit. The racism and class hierarchy within these circles was not loud. It was polished, disguised as etiquette, but sharpened like a blade underneath every smile. Alessandro's response was not immediate violence. It was restraint, and that restraint unsettled everyone more than brutality ever could. Because when a man like him chose silence over retaliation, it meant he was planning something far more precise. Security footage began showing unusual movement patterns across estates and affiliated properties. Rival organizations started losing contact with key operatives. Fear did not rise suddenly. It accumulated slowly, like pressure before collapse. Claire, however, experienced a different kind of isolation. She was no longer simply a guest inside the mansion. She was a monitored variable inside a system she did not understand. Her movements were tracked under the excuse of protection. Her conversations were indirectly observed. Even her moments alone with the child felt layered with invisible attention. It created a psychological strain that blurred the line between safety and imprisonment. Despite this, something unexpected began forming beneath the surface tension. Alessandro's behavior toward the child did not match the brutality of his reputation. He did not approach with softness, but with control that bordered on restraint. He ensured the child's routines remained stable, his environment untouched by external chaos. There was no warmth in it that could be easily recognized, but there was consistency. And in their world, consistency from a man like him carried meaning. Rival Mafia families interpreted this differently. To them, Claire and the child were not individuals. They were leverage points, strategic weaknesses that could destabilize an empire. Meetings began forming in private locations across states. Plans were drafted not around negotiation, but removal. The idea of eliminating Claire was no longer theoretical. It was being scheduled. Inside Alessandro's inner circle, cracks began to appear. Loyalty was no longer absolute. Some members feared his emotional restraint was clouding judgment. Others believed it was strategic brilliance disguised as vulnerability. Either way, uncertainty spread faster than loyalty ever could. And in that uncertainty, betrayal began forming silently. Claire began noticing patterns. Staff members who avoided eye contact too long. Conversations that stopped too quickly. Doors that remained locked longer than necessary. The mansion was no longer just a residence. It was a structure under psychological siege, and she was at its center. One night, she overheard a fragmented conversation between security personnel mentioning coordinated movements outside the state, not threats of intrusion, but preparation for something larger, something synchronized. It suggested that multiple organizations were no longer acting independently. They were aligning. At the same time, Alessandro's behavior shifted subtly. He began appearing in locations without announcement, watching from distances rather than engaging directly. His presence became less about interaction and more about assessment, as if he was calculating outcomes no one else could see yet. Claire's emotional state deteriorated under the weight of uncertainty. She no longer knew whether her fear came from external threats or the environment itself. The child remained her only grounding point, the only constant that felt untouched by the invisible war unfolding around them. But even that sense of stability began to feel fragile as protection tightened further. Then came the moment that changed everything. A confidential security breach occurred within the mansion system. Not external intrusion, but internal extraction. Data related to Claire's past began resurfacing in unauthorized channels. Financial records, identity fragments, and buried among them, something far more dangerous. A connection linking her late sister to operations once tied directly to Alessandro Moretti's personal history. This discovery did not reach Claire directly. It reached Alessandro first. And for the first time since her arrival, his controlled silence broke in a way no one inside the mansion had ever witnessed. Not through rage, but through recognition. As if pieces of a past he had spent years burying had suddenly returned with precise timing. Within hours, security across all connected properties escalated without explanation. Communication channels tightened. External access points were sealed. And Claire, without being told, understood something had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a protected individual. Inside his empire, she was now connected to its origin. That night, while the mansion remained under silent lockdown, Claire was escorted, not forcefully, but decisively, to a restricted section she had never been allowed to enter before. The atmosphere was different there, heavier, older, as if the building itself carried memory in its walls. Alessandro was already inside when she arrived. He did not look at her immediately. Instead, he stared at something behind her, something that carried more weight than the present moment. His expression was not anger, not fear, something far more unsettling, recognition. And beneath that recognition, something dangerously close to unresolved history waiting to surface again. Before Claire could fully understand why she had been brought there, the security system across the mansion went offline for exactly 3 seconds. In that silence, every lock protocol disengaged at once. Doors unlocked, cameras froze, communication systems cut out, and when they came back online, Alessandro's voice was the only thing that broke the restored silence. Not an order, a warning, because someone inside his own empire had just confirmed what he had feared for years. Claire was not an outsider who had wandered into his world. She was the key to a past that someone had tried very hard to keep buried. And outside the mansion walls, movements had already begun, the kind that could not be reversed once initiated. The first sign that the Moretti estate was no longer under control came without warning. It did not arrive with alarms or announcements. It arrived as silence breaking unevenly across different wings of the mansion, like a system losing synchronization with itself. Security personnel who had always moved with precision suddenly hesitated at corners. Communication devices flickered with interference. Doors that should have remained locked disengaged without command. Claire felt the shift before she understood it. She was in one of the eastern corridors when the atmosphere changed completely. The child, usually calm under her presence, became tense without knowing why. That instinct alone was enough for her to realize something inside the mansion had gone wrong. Then the first explosion sounded in the distance. It was not large enough to destroy the estate, but it was close enough to shake its foundation of illusion. The sound traveled through the marble corridors like a physical force. Within seconds, movement erupted everywhere. Staff scattered in confusion. Security teams attempted to reorganize without clear orders. And for the first time since Claire had arrived, Alessandro Moretti's control did not appear absolute. He appeared, not as a composed figure she had seen before, but as something sharper, more immediate. His presence cut through chaos instead of containing it. His first action was not toward the attackers or the system. It was toward the child. He took the boy without hesitation. There was no negotiation in that movement, no emotional display that could be misread as vulnerability. It was direct, controlled urgency. The child instinctively clung to him, not out of trust, but out of survival instinct recognizing stronger protection. Claire followed without being told. The mansion, once a structured environment of silent hierarchy, had become unpredictable. Armed men had breached outer perimeters, their identity unclear at first, but their coordination suggesting internal knowledge of the estate systems. This was not a random attack. It was synchronized. Inside the chaos, Vanessa DeMarco moved differently than the others. She did not flee or panic. She observed. Her communication with external contacts continued even as the estate destabilized. She was no longer just a manipulator within the system. She was actively shaping its collapse. Damien Cross appeared in parallel, not physically inside the mansion at first, but operating through intercepted channels. His influence extended across both federal and criminal lines, shifting alliances in real time. Orders that should have gone to law enforcement were delayed. Criminal responses that should have been coordinated were redirected. The attack on the mansion was not just physical, it was informational warfare. Claire realized quickly that the state was not under one attack. It was under multiple overlapping betrayals. The psychological pressure inside the mansion intensified. Staff members who had spent years maintaining order now abandoned positions. Some attempted to escape. Others tried to secure restricted areas. But every movement felt too slow against the unfolding breakdown. Alessandro moved through it all with controlled aggression. He did not lose composure in the traditional sense. Instead, he became more focused, more precise, as if chaos itself sharpened his instincts rather than weakening them. But Claire noticed something she had never seen before. He was checking behind him more often, not for enemies, for the child. That realization altered something in her perception of him. Alessandro Moretti, the man feared across multiple cities, was no longer operating purely as an empire leader. He was operating as someone protecting a single point of emotional importance. And that point was a child in his arms. As they moved deeper into the mansion's central corridors, resistance increased. Rival factions inside the estate revealed themselves. Some security personnel who had once served Alessandro shifted sides mid-conflict. Betrayal was no longer theoretical. It was visible in real time. Vanessa's influence became clearer through intercepted communication fragments. She was not simply spreading misinformation. She was coordinating perception, ensuring that rival families believed Alessandro was weaker than he was, while simultaneously ensuring federal pressure increased at precisely the right moments. It was not chaos she was creating. It was controlled destabilization. Damian Cross operated in that same space, balancing legality and manipulation. Federal agents outside the estate were delayed, rerouted, or reassigned without explanation. Criminal factions inside the estate received conflicting intelligence. It was as if the entire conflict had been engineered to ensure no side could fully stabilize. Claire struggled to process the scale of what was happening. She had entered a mansion that once felt like a prison. Now it felt like the center of a collapsing system that extended far beyond its walls. At one point, they passed through a corridor where hidden weapons were being retrieved by personnel Claire had never seen before. These were not regular guards. They were deeper assets, individuals activated only under extreme breach conditions. Their presence confirmed that Alessandro had always anticipated scenarios like this. But even prepared systems were failing now. As they moved through the chaos, Claire saw Alessandro hesitate for the first time. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal that even his control had limits under simultaneous internal and external betrayal. The child noticed it too, tightening his grip slightly. Alessandro adjusted his hold immediately, stabilizing the child's fear without words. That single gesture carried more emotional weight than anything Claire had seen from him before. It was not performative. It was instinctive. For a brief moment, the violence outside seemed secondary to the connection forming in that movement. Claire did not miss it. Something inside her shifted in response. Not trust, not safety, something more dangerous. Understanding without permission. They reached a central security junction, where systems were partially still functional. Alessandro attempted to regain control through manual override protocols, but internal sabotage had already fragmented core access. The mansion was no longer responding as a unified structure. It was responding as broken segments. That was when the second wave of explosions began. Stronger this time. Closer. The structure shook violently. Lights failed across multiple wings. Emergency systems activated, but even they were unstable. Claire nearly lost her footing, but Alessandro steadied both her and the child without shifting his focus away from the corridor ahead. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Alessandro spoke for the first time in a way that was not an order. It was recognition of inevitability. The Empire was no longer something that could be controlled. It was something being dismantled from inside. Rival families had not simply attacked. They had synchronized betrayal across multiple layers of influence. Political, financial, and criminal systems were collapsing simultaneously. This was not an attempt to seize power. It was an attempt to erase structure itself. Claire finally understood the full weight of her position inside this conflict. She was not collateral. She was a focal point. Every faction wanted her either removed or controlled because of what she represented in the hidden history of the Moretti system. But Alessandro's focus never left the child. Even as the mansion burned into fragments of order, he continued moving with him as if preserving something irreplaceable. Claire realized something she could not deny anymore. The fear people had for Alessandro Moretti was not because he destroyed enemies. It was because when he chose something to protect, nothing in the world mattered more than that choice. And that made him more dangerous than any betrayal unfolding around them. They reached the main exit corridor just as internal systems began locking down independently. The mansion was now operating under fragmented protocols, sealing sections automatically as structural instability increased. Alessandro adjusted direction instantly, but it was too late. The final system override triggered across the estate, and every gate leading out of the mansion locked at once. Outside, the first full-scale detonations began across the grounds. The estate was no longer just under attack. It was being erased from the map. By the time dawn approached the horizon, the Moretti mansion no longer resembled a residence of power. It had become something else entirely, a collapsing system of secrets, where every corridor carried the aftermath of choices made long before Claire ever entered its gates. The silence that once defined the estate had been replaced by distant screams, fractured alarms, and the heavy sound of structural failure. The attack did not arrive as a single coordinated strike. It unfolded in waves, each one revealing that betrayal had already been planted deep inside Alessandro Moretti's organization. What appeared to be security personnel moments earlier were now turning on each other. Loyalty, once absolute in appearance, dissolved into confusion and survival instinct. Claire was pulled into motion before she could fully process what was happening. Alessandro did not hesitate. The child remained in his arms, pressed against him with protective precision. His movements were no longer measured for control. They were optimized for survival. Every step he took carried the weight of someone who had already calculated outcomes no one else could see yet. Innocent staff members scattered to the halls, some collapsing under crossfire they never understood. Others were caught between exits that had sealed automatically due to compromised systems. The mansion, once a controlled environment, had turned into a closed circuit of violence. Claire saw it clearly now. This was not a simple attack. It was a dismantling. Alessandro moved through the chaos with brutal efficiency when necessary. Those who turned on him were dealt with in moments that left no room for hesitation. But even in that violence, his focus remained unchanged. The child never left his grip, and Claire remained within his immediate reach. That consistency unsettled her more than anything else, because it revealed something deeper beneath his reputation. This was not random brutality. It was prioritization. Damian Cross appeared in fragments of intercepted communication rather than physical presence. His manipulation was structural, not visible. Federal forces outside the mansion perimeter hesitated at key moments, delayed by conflicting intelligence. Criminal factions attempting to coordinate against Alessandro found themselves redirected into false opportunities. It was as if every group believed they were controlling the collapse, when in reality they were only participating in it. Vanessa DeMarco's influence surfaced fully in those moments. Her betrayal was not sudden. It had been layered into the system long before the attack began. She had ensured rival families were synchronized at the exact moment Alessandro's internal structure would be weakest. She had not just participated in the collapse. She had designed its timing. Claire began to understand that what was happening inside the mansion was only one layer of a larger war. A war that extended into politics, finance, and legacy systems that had operated unseen for decades. As they moved deeper into the estate's compromised corridors, Alessandro finally encountered what remained of internal loyalty. Some of his own organization had been compromised. Not all betrayal came from outside. Some had been cultivated internally, waiting for moments like this to surface. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Alessandro did not waste time on uncertainty. Those who were exposed as traitors were removed from the system with immediate finality. It was not emotional. It was structural correction. Claire struggled to process the speed of it. The man she had feared for his control was now using that same control to dismantle his own empire piece by piece. And yet, he never once loosened his hold on the child. That contradiction stayed with her even as explosions began to intensify across the mansion's eastern wing. Entire sections of the structure were now failing under coordinated destruction. Fire spread through luxury corridors that once symbolized power. Marble floors cracked under heat and pressure. The estate was no longer being fought over. It was being erased. Claire's emotional state fractured under the pressure of simultaneous fear and understanding. She was no longer simply trying to survive the chaos. She was trying to understand why Alessandro continued to move with such certainty through destruction that appeared to target everything he had built. Then she noticed something she should have seen earlier. He was not reacting to the collapse. He was guiding it. The realization did not come through words. It came through pattern recognition. Certain areas were evacuated before explosions occurred. Certain systems failed in controlled sequences rather than random collapse. Routes through the mansion remained accessible just long enough for specific individuals to pass before sealing behind them. Alessandro was not losing control of his empire. He was dismantling it with precision, and Claire and the child were being moved through its collapse intentionally. As the emotional weight of that realization settled in, Claire's memory shifted to fragments of her past conversations, documents she had seen, and subtle inconsistencies in the financial records she had uncovered earlier. Everything pointed toward a hidden intention she had not fully understood until now. The Empire was not being saved. It was being emptied. At one critical moment inside a collapsing corridor, Claire witnessed Vanessa DeMarco attempt to communicate with external forces, only to realize her channels had already been cut. Her influence, once carefully constructed, was now collapsing under its own exposure. For the first time, her control failed in real time. Damian Cross's manipulation also reached its limit. Federal forces began advancing without coordination, finally realizing they had been misled into delayed positioning. But by then, the internal destruction had already reached irreversible stages. Alessandro continued forward, always forward, never retreating into chaos, always guiding through it. Then Claire saw something that changed the emotional direction of everything she believed she understood. During a brief moment of clarity in the chaos, Alessandro positioned the child in a secured corridor section and for the first time looked directly at Claire without calculation, not as an observer, not as controller of outcomes, but as someone carrying an unbearable truth. And without speaking aloud, she understood. The Empire was not collapsing because it had been attacked. It was collapsing because it had reached a point where it could no longer exist without destroying everything innocent within it. The child represented the only exception, a life untouched by the structure that had produced all this violence. And Alessandro had made his decision long before the first explosion. Claire finally understood the emotional hook hidden beneath everything she had experienced. Alessandro was not trying to save his empire. He was trying to save the child from becoming part of it. The realization hit her with emotional weight she could not immediately process. It reframed every act of violence, every control movement, every calculated delay. Nothing he had done was random. Everything had been preparation for separation. Before Claire could fully react to that understanding, the mansion reached its breaking point. A massive internal explosion tore through the central structure, collapsing multiple wings simultaneously. Heat and pressure forced emergency evacuation systems into overload. Visibility dropped. Structural integrity failed in seconds. Alessandro reacted instantly. He pushed Claire and the child toward the only remaining exit corridor that still held structural stability. And for the first time, his control did not appear absolute. It appeared final, a closing decision, a completed sequence. Then, as another explosion triggered deeper within the mansion, Alessandro turned without hesitation and moved back into the burning structure. Claire reached out instinctively, but the collapsing corridor separated them. For a moment, she saw him clearly through smoke and fire, still moving forward, not away from danger, into it, and then the structure collapsed between them. Alessandro Moretti disappeared inside the burning mansion after saving Claire and the child from the explosion. Months after the mansion's destruction, the world had already rewritten the story of Alessandro Moretti in the simplest way it could manage. Powerful men across America spoke his name less often, but when they did, it carried the same weight it always had, fear mixed with uncertainty. Because men like Alessandro were not supposed to disappear without consequences. They were supposed to either rule or be buried, not vanish into fire without explanation. Claire did not believe in simple endings anymore. She lived in a quieter version of survival now, far from the ruins of the Moretti estate, raising the child in an environment stripped of luxury, but not of memory. Every attempt at normal life felt temporary, like something borrowed rather than owned. The world outside continued moving, but for her, time had fractured into before and after. The child changed in ways Claire could not fully explain. He was quieter in public, more observant in private, and often stood near windows longer than necessary, not out of curiosity, but expectation, as if waiting for something the world had already decided would never return. Claire noticed it, but did not correct it, because she did not fully believe it herself. The Moretti Empire, once structured under absolute control, fractured rapidly after the collapse. Without Alessandro's stabilizing presence, rival families surged forward like predators sensing weakened territory. Violent internal conflicts erupted across cities. Alliances that had once been stable dissolved overnight. Power shifted constantly, with no central force strong enough to hold it together. Damian Cross emerged from that instability differently than others. While criminal factions fought openly, Damian's influence expanded through systems that remained partially invisible. Political channels, legal structures, enforcement agencies all began reflecting subtle shifts aligned with his positioning. He did not claim territory the way Mafia leaders did. He absorbed structure the way systems absorbed inevitability. Claire received the first coded message 3 months after the mansion fell. It arrived without sender identification, embedded within a routine financial document tied to a closed account she had never personally accessed. The message was not direct. It was fragmented, coordinates, timings, references to locations that had no public relevance. But something inside it felt familiar. Not the content, the pattern. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she stored it, waiting for a second confirmation that never came. Days later, a second message appeared, then a third, each one more precise, each one pointing away from public spaces and towards something buried beneath abandoned infrastructure in the city. The abandoned cathedral appeared first in fragmented references, not as a location, but as a symbol repeatedly tied to financial irregularities hidden beneath older systems. Beneath the city's visible structure, there were vaults, tunnels, and forgotten architectural layers that had once been part of older power networks. Claire began investigating quietly, driven less by choice and more by inevitability. During that time, she uncovered something she had not expected to find again: records tied directly to her sister. Documents she had believed were destroyed. Reports that suggested her sister had not been an accidental casualty of corruption, but someone who had come dangerously close to exposing it. And connected to those records was a name that appeared too often to be coincidence: Alessandro Moretti. But the timeline did not align with the narrative she had been told. The deeper she went, the more she realized the story of her sister's involvement was not separate from Alessandro's empire. It was embedded within its foundation. Claire began to understand something unsettling. The empire had not simply been built on power. It had been built on concealment. Psychological pressure returned slowly, not through external threats, but through internal uncertainty. She began noticing patterns again, vehicles that appeared too often in the same areas, unfamiliar individuals observing from distances, changes in digital traces that suggested monitoring without confirmation. The paranoia was no longer imagined. It was structured. And yet, alongside fear, something else began forming: hope, because inconsistencies were also appearing in Alessandro's supposed death. Financial systems tied to his network were still active in fragmented ways. Not fully operational, but not entirely closed either. Certain accounts that should have been permanently sealed showed periodic movement, small transfers, controlled activations, signals that suggested continuity rather than collapse. Claire refused to accept the idea immediately, but the child did not. He continued standing near windows at night, sometimes speaking quietly about seeing shadows outside that did not belong to the present environment. Not fearfully, expectantly. Claire began to notice it too, and slowly, unwillingly, she started following the same instinct. The clues eventually led her toward infrastructure buried beneath the city's older transit systems. Abandoned tunnels, sealed maintenance corridors, and forgotten access points that had once connected major power structures before modern expansion erased them from public awareness. At the center of those routes, repeated references pointed toward one location: the abandoned cathedral beneath Chicago. Emotionally, Claire resisted the idea. Rationally, she tried to dismiss it. But every layer of evidence converged toward the same conclusion. Whatever remained of Alessandro Moretti, if anything remained at all, would not be in a world above ground. It would be below it. The emotional conflict inside her intensified. Alessandro had been fear, protection, destruction, and control all at once. He had taken her from survival to captivity to something dangerously close to understanding. And now, in his absence, he had become something even more unstable, a possibility. Fear and hope no longer existed separately inside Claire. They overlapped until she could no longer distinguish which one was stronger. Fear told her returning meant danger. Hope told her absence meant deception. The child became the center of that conflict without knowing it. His attachment to windows, to waiting, to silence before nightfall, all of it suggested belief in something Claire was still trying to deny. One night, after weeks of coded fragments and partial confirmations, Claire received a final set of coordinates. Unlike the previous ones, this message carried no ambiguity. It was direct in structure, but not in explanation. It pointed beneath the city's underground grid, toward a location that had been deliberately hidden from modern mapping systems. The cathedral was not simply a place. It was a cover, a structure built over something older, something sealed, something protected. Claire did not tell anyone when she left, not because she trusted secrecy, but because she no longer trusted interpretation. Every version of the truth she had been given had eventually collapsed. The only certainty left was movement. As she descended into the underground network, the environment changed. Sound dampened. Light became artificial and intermittent. The city above felt increasingly distant, as if it belonged to a different world entirely. The deeper she went, the more the architecture shifted from functional to intentional. Corridors that should have been abandoned showed signs of recent maintenance. Electrical systems that should have been dead flickered in controlled intervals. Someone had been there. Recently, at the final junction before the cathedral's lower access point, Claire stopped, because she was no longer alone. Footsteps echoed ahead of her, slow and deliberate, not rushed or hidden. The kind of movement that suggested awareness rather than avoidance. She stepped forward cautiously, expecting resistance, expecting danger. Instead, she saw something that stopped her completely. A silhouette standing inside the cathedral's lower shadow line. Still, recognizable and impossible, because Alessandro Moretti was supposed to be gone, but what he held in his hand made her breath collapse instantly. It was a child's lost necklace. And in that moment, everything she believed about survival, death, and absence began to fracture all over again. Claire realized Alessandro was not hiding from the world. He was waiting for her to find him. The final time Alessandro reached for Claire's son, the world above them had already begun to collapse into irreversible chaos. Not a sudden collapse, but a carefully unspooling system of power that had once stretched across cities, governments, and hidden financial networks. Every structure built on secrecy was now collapsing under the weight of its own exposure. The abandoned cathedral beneath the city was no longer abandoned. It had become the final convergence point. Inside its vast, shadowed interior, representatives of fractured Mafia families, corrupted political figures, and remaining loyalists from Alessandro's dismantled empire stood in unstable silence. None of them had come willingly. All of them had been pulled here by forces they no longer fully understood. Claire stood at the edge of the lower chamber, the child close beside her. Alessandro was already there, positioned at the center where broken architecture met reinforced underground stone. He no longer looked like a man holding power. He looked like a man standing at the end of something he had spent his entire life building and destroying at the same time. Damian Cross was present, though not in the way others expected. His influence extended through surrounding enforcement units already tightening their perimeter above ground. Federal forces were converging, but their timing was no longer decisive. The structure beneath the city had already become its own battlefield. Vanessa DeMarco's presence was revealed not through appearance, but through the consequences of her actions. The final betrayal she had orchestrated across factions had already reached their breaking point. Alliances she had manipulated no longer held. Information she had controlled had already leaked into public channels. The system she had used to rise was now collapsing around her, and at the center of it all stood Alessandro Moretti, no longer an empire builder, but a man standing inside the consequences of every choice he had ever made. The child remained close to Claire, but his attention was not on fear. It was on Alessandro, because something about him had changed, not in presence, but in clarity. The truth behind the hidden child was no longer fragmented. It converged into a single narrative that tied Claire's sister, Alessandro's past, and corrupted foundation of the Moretti Empire into one origin point. The child had not been an accident of secrecy. He had been the result of a long chain of decisions made to protect something fragile inside a system built for destruction. Claire's sister had not been an unrelated casualty. She had been part of the original rupture. Years earlier, She had uncovered financial pipelines connecting political figures to trafficking networks hidden beneath charitable organizations and legitimate corporations. Her investigation had intersected directly with Alessandro's internal war against his own empire's corruption. What neither side had realized at the time was that exposing the truth would collapse structures too large to survive transparency. The child was born from that collision, a consequence of secrecy, protection, and fear. Alessandro stepped forward slowly, and the entire cathedral shifted in response. Not physically, but psychologically. Every faction present understood instinctively that whatever happened next would determine the structure of power far beyond this single location. He stopped in front of Claire and the child. For a moment, there was no empire, no corruption, no betrayal. Only silence shaped by recognition. Alessandro finally spoke not as a ruler, but as someone carrying something heavier than authority. The child, he said through implication rather than declaration, was the only reason he had not already destroyed everything without hesitation. The only variable that made redemption feel mathematically possible in a world designed for monsters. That admission fractured something inside Claire's understanding of him, because it removed the illusion of control she had always associated with his actions. What remained was intention. Raw, unfiltered intention shaped by loss, protection, and consequence. The cathedral began to destabilize further as external pressure increased. Federal forces above ground were closing in, but internal systems within the underground network were already activating irreversible protocols. Evidence vaults were releasing data simultaneously across multiple global channels. Corruption networks that had operated for decades were being exposed in real time. Politicians who had once believed themselves untouchable were now watching their identities dissolve into public record exposure. Financial systems tied to trafficking routes collapsed as digital transparency overrides activated across international servers. Entire layers of influence were being erased not through violence, but through revelation. Damian Cross attempted to regain control of remaining federal response structures, but even his influence was now limited by the scale of exposure. The system had expanded beyond individual manipulation. It had become self-revealing. Vanessa's final attempts to redirect blame and narrative failed, as her own communications were traced and broadcast internally. Every manipulation she had executed was now visible in full sequence. Her power did not collapse in silence. It collapsed in exposure, and Alessandro Moretti stood at the center of it all without resistance. Claire realized what was happening only when she saw the pattern complete. This was not a final battle for control. It was a controlled dissolution. Alessandro had not been trying to preserve his empire. He had been preparing it for irreversible exposure from the beginning of its final phase. Every betrayal, every attack, every collapse had been guided into a structure designed to end without regeneration. The emotional hook embedded in everything she had experienced suddenly became clear. Alessandro had never been building toward survival. He had been building toward an end that would not repeat itself. The child represented continuity outside of corruption, a future untouched by inherited systems. That was the real reason he had protected him. Not legacy, not power, possibility. Claire's emotional resistance finally broke at that realization. Fear no longer held authority over her understanding. What replaced it was something more complex, grief for what had been lost, and recognition of what had been preserved. The cathedral's structural integrity began failing as external pressure and internal collapse synchronized. Fire spread through upper access points. Smoke filtered down into the lower chambers. Emergency evacuation systems activated too late to reverse the sequence already in motion. Federal agents surrounded the cathedral's external perimeter, sealing exits above ground. But inside, everything had already transitioned beyond containment. Alessandro turned once more toward Claire and the child, and this time his presence carried finality rather than command. The empire was gone, not inherited, not transferred, ended. He stepped back from them slowly, creating distance not of abandonment, but of separation from consequence. Claire understood before anyone spoke that what came next would not be survival for him in the traditional sense. It would be resolution. He moved toward the collapsing center of the cathedral, where structural supports had already begun to fail. The fire above intensified, casting shifting light, through fractured stone and broken architecture. The world around him was becoming unstable in real time. Claire reached forward instinctively, but did not move closer, because she understood something she had not understood before. Alessandro Moretti was not running. He was completing something. Above them, the final systems triggered across the network. Every remaining corruption node was exposed simultaneously. Financial records, political ties, criminal pathways, all released into global visibility. The empire did not fall quietly. It dissolved publicly. Alessandro stopped one final time before the collapsing center, and in that moment, the truth behind everything crystallized. He had chosen sacrifice over survival, not to escape consequences, but to ensure consequences could not be inherited. The child reached toward him instinctively, but Claire held him back gently, her understanding finally aligning with reality instead of fear. Alessandro looked at them one last time, not as a ruler, not as a criminal, but as something closer to human than anything he had ever been allowed to be. Then he stepped into the collapsing firelight. The structure shifted violently, and he disappeared inside the burning cathedral as the final systems collapsed around him. Moments later, federal agents breached the outer perimeter as flames consumed the underground structure. Smoke poured upward through access points. Structural failure cascaded through multiple layers of the cathedral's hidden architecture. Claire held the child tightly as the world above finally reached him again. But Alessandro was gone. Or at least, that was what the world recorded. Because as federal agents secured the ruins and cataloged what remained of the collapse, one fact refused to align with every system of confirmation they attempted to generate. Alessandro Moretti's body was never recovered from the ruins.